Welcome to IFA. I fix everything.
Today's project is a 1986 Pontiac Fiero with a seized rear brake caliper. I hadn't driven very far when I noticed the car wasn't tracking properly, so I applied the brakes to see if it would affect the way the car was handling. The car stopped smoothly and evenly. I returned home to check the steering and the braking system. So I naturally began with the front end. With the car on jacks, I rotated the steering wheel from lock to lock, listening and feeling for any signs of wear or binding. Then I rotated the wheels and checked for any slop in the wheel bearings. Lastly, I applied the brakes and then rotated the wheels again to make sure they were running free. The front end checked out fine, so I turned my attention to the rear axle. It didn't take long to find the source of the problem. With the car jacked up and safely supported on jack stands, I removed the rear wheel and used a large bar to break the brake rotor free from the caliper. I attempted to free the brake caliper piston by rotating the rotor forward and back several times. The first time I applied the brakes, the caliper was seized solid. It was time to remove the brake caliper for a complete overhaul. These are the tools and accessories I used to rebuild all 4 brake calipers on my 1986 Pontiac Fiero GT. This includes the whole process, from the removal to the teardown, cleaning, polishing, and reinstallation and bleeding. Your tool list may be different. You may not be including the cleaning and polishing as part of your overhaul process. These are the brushes I used to clean and polish the brake calipers. This photo shows the parts, lubricants, and fluids that I used for the brake overhaul. You may notice this photo includes wheel bearings, a brake hose, brake banjo bolt, and sealing washers. To release the emergency brake cable from the actuator arm, I clamped the cable end with vice grips and rolled it free with a circular motion. To release the emergency brake cable return spring, I used an Automotive trim tool. I placed it in the center of the spring and levered it against the tab that locks the spring in place. I chose an Automotive trim tool because of its angled tip. You could also use a brake spoon or a large screwdriver. I removed the brake hose support, so when I disconnected the brake hose from the caliper, the fluid would not drip on the lower control arm and the ball joint. The brake hose banjo bolt was removed, and the brake fluid gravity drained into the bucket. As the brake hose was draining, I began removing the brake caliper mount bolts. The original equipment brake bolts use a Torx T50. However, some aftermarket bolts are an Allen socket. I found by accident that the T50 will also remove the Allen bolts. The seized caliper had quite a grip on the brake rotor. I used a large bar to rotate it free. My initial reaction was to rebuild both rear calipers so that the braking would be equivalent. I'm gravity draining the whole system to prevent future contamination. Once again, I'm using a Torx T50 on a 3/8 ratchet to remove the brake caliper bolt. Here's a second look at my method for removing the emergency brake cable and the return spring. With the spring removed, I have more clearance to remove the lower brake caliper bolt. I attempted to remove the emergency brake cable bracket from the caliper with an impact driver. It didn't work. So my next option is to remove the cable from the bracket. There's a special tool designed for this job. I found a small hose clamp, and penetrating oil is the best tool to remove the cable from the bracket. Spray the clip with your choice of penetrating oil, then wrap a hose clamp around it and tighten it securely. Apply tension to the cable and then loosen the clamp until the cable pulls free. The brake fluid showed signs of heavy contamination. I decided it was time to rebuild the front calipers as well. Rotating the front wheels allows easy access to the brake mounting bolts. I used a C-clamp to compress the piston on the front calipers to allow easier removal. Do not attempt to use a C-clamp on the rear brake calipers. The piston or the emergency brake actuator can be damaged. If a Torx T50 bites into the Allen bolt, Thread it back into the hole partially and then wiggle it side to side to break it free. I repeated the procedure and removed the front passenger side brake caliper. This photograph shows the condition of one of the rear brake calipers. The seized brake caliper was cleaned first with a heavy-duty degreaser and a stiff bristled brush. I was able to remove the stubborn brake caliper bolts and sliding sleeves with a pair of vice grips and an unthreading motion. While trying to remove the emergency brake cable bracket, I sheared off a Torx bit. I removed the brake caliper bolt dust boots with an Automotive trim tool. The sliding sleeve was seized to the brake caliper. I drove it free with a shouldered punch. I'm using the Automotive trim tool once again, this time to remove the outer brake pad. I find it easiest to remove the sliding pin seals with a scribe. Note, they're going to be replaced in the rebuild. There are no special tools needed to eject the rear caliper piston. Rotate the emergency brake actuator screw and it'll drive the piston from the bore. Moisture contamination in the brake fluid has pitted the piston's chrome surface. This in turn caused the brake seizure. I gripped the outer rim of the brake piston to remove it from the caliper bore. Using an unthreading motion, I removed the brake caliper spring. I rotated a screwdriver around the circumference of the dust seal and levered it free. I used an aluminum seal pick to prevent scratches to the piston bore. I have gotten the best results using Lennox tapping oil to penetrate rust. Remove the actuator arm, then the fiber friction washer. If the actuator screw is seized, apply some penetrating oil and rotate it with a ratchet or wrench. If you must tap on it, leave the nut in place to prevent damage to the threads. This is a detailed image of the internal screw and its copper bushing. Lennox tapping oil was applied to the bleeder screw to prevent damage. I used a 10mm socket and a hammer to shock the threads on this rusted bleeder screw. With all the parts removed from the caliper, I was now able to add some heat to the bleeder screw. I used a map torch to heat the bleeder screw. I didn't feel comfortable applying heat directly to the aluminum caliper. I applied gentle pressure to the bleeder screw periodically throughout the heating process until it came free. Here's a detailed shot removing the sliding caliper pin seals. The piston chrome surface is severely corroded. The check valve must be removed from the piston dome prior to cleaning. The seal is seated to the inside surface of the emergency brake cable actuator arm. The brake caliper was degreased prior to disassembly. Now the iron parts will be soaked in muriatic acid to further remove any corrosion. The brake piston is chromed. Do not soak chromed parts in muriatic acid. It will remove the chrome instantly. The parts were soaked in a closed lid jug and agitated periodically to improve the cleaning process. I brushed muriatic acid onto the emergency brake cable bracket and the mounting bolt. This should dissolve the rust and make removal of the bolt easier. The parts have been transferred to an open-top container. Here they can be inspected and the details can be cleaned with a brush. I neutralized the muriatic acid with clear water. Now I'm going to use the heat from a map torch to release the stuck screw from the emergency brake cable bracket. I tried heat from a map torch and a hammer-style impact driver. This went on for about 5 minutes with no success. I switched to an impact gun and the bolt came out immediately. I've now switched over to the passenger side rear caliper for disassembly. Here's a close-up of the brake pads showing the inner brake pad retaining clip. I clamped vice grips to the actuator arm to act as a handle to stop the actuator from rotating as I broke the nut free. With the arm removed, I'm now removing the actuator seal, followed by the friction washer. The cable bracket screw on this caliper was not seized and was easy to remove. The passenger side brake caliper bolts removed with the dust boots. Once again, I had to remove the sleeves with a punch. It's important to note the bolts and the sleeves are assembled at the factory and should not come apart. Carefully remove the brake bolt seals. There is one at each end of the bore. I've now turned my attention to the front brake caliper teardown. The outer brake pad is easily removed by levering a screwdriver against the brake piston clearance cutout. I used a screwdriver to remove the brake bolt dust boots. I unseated the brake bolt sleeves with a hammer and then they slid free. I plugged the brake line port with a bolt and began the cleanup process of each of the brake calipers. I began with the caliper bodies and then I cleaned all the brake hardware. After soaking them in engine degreaser and giving them a thorough washing, I placed them on a paint pan as an improvised drying rack. I took advantage of the ridges on the paint roller pan to sort the small hardware and keep it from rolling. The baked-on grease and grime was too much for the engine degreaser, so I turned my attention to mineral spirits to finish the job. Mineral spirits leaves an oily residue, so a final rinse with alcohol was in order. Thank you for watching part 1 of the Fiero brake overhaul series. Stay tuned for part 2 where I'll show you how I achieved these results. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more content, remember, subscribers are always welcome.